On a scorching morning, Judge Thomas Scott delivered a momentous verdict, 60 years in prison for a young man he firmly believed was guilty. But was he truly guilty? Or was this a devastating mistake, an oversight by a justice system blind to the truth? Can you imagine the weight on a judge's conscience upon realizing that his decision has destroyed an innocent life? Can justice ever rectify such an error? Join us as we unravel this gripping and suspenseful story. Don't forget to leave a comment and subscribe to never miss another compelling tale. The courtroom was silent, every pair of eyes fixed on Judge Thomas Scott. Seated firmly on the bench, his weathered face bore the marks of 35 years of delivering justice. His hands steady as ever. His words echoed in the tense atmosphere. Benjamin King, I sentence you to 60 years in prison. The weight of this decision was palpable, but for 24-year-old Benjamin King, it wasn't just a sentence, it was a stolen life. Benjamin's eyes never left his mother, who sat in the back row, her face streaked with grief. All her life she had dreamed of seeing her son succeed, not be branded a criminal in shackles. Both mother and son understood that in this moment, everything could change. But would the truth ever come to light? Or would Benjamin be condemned to bear the shackles of a wrongful conviction for the rest of his life? Benjamin had never wavered in his claim of innocence. His voice rang through the courtroom as he faced the jury. I didn't do this. I wasn't anywhere near that store. I don't even own the gun they claim is mine. He recounted in detail how he had been working at an auto shop the day of the robbery. But the evidence told a different story. Despite his sincerity, the jury remained unmoved. A witness identified him from a blurry surveillance tape, and his fingerprints on the recovered gun were deemed undeniable. The case appeared airtight. No room for doubt. Judge Scott's gaze remained cold and unyielding, but deep inside, a gnawing question took root. He had presided over thousands of cases, rendered countless verdicts, yet something about this young man troubled him. There was an unsettling feeling, a whisper of doubt beneath the mountain of evidence. Benjamin had once aspired to be a firefighter, a young man filled with hope and purpose. Was he truly guilty, or was there an unseen piece of this puzzle? Benjamin stood tall, his eyes unwavering, not of a defeated man, but of someone who refused to surrender. Despite the damning evidence, he clung to the belief in his innocence as if it were the last thread of hope keeping him afloat. But within him, an unspoken anguish grew, frustration, isolation, and the chilling fear of a future locked away in a cage. As Judge Scott's gavel struck the sound block, sealing the 60-year sentence, the room seemed to freeze in time. Benjamin and his mother knew this was not the end. This was only the beginning of a battle, not just to prove his innocence, but to unearth the truth buried deep in the shadows. In a world where justice is not always blind, will the truth prevail? Or will it remain silenced within the unforgiving machinery of the legal system? The weight of the verdict still lingered in the courtroom. Though everyone had left, the silence clung to the air like an unspoken presence. Judge Thomas Scott sat in his chambers, his fingers lightly grazing the scattered documents on his desk, exhaustion settling into his bones after a long day. The hurried voices of reporters outside had faded. The sentence had been delivered, 60 years in prison for Benjamin King, a young man convicted of armed robbery. Though Judge Scott had always prided himself on his unwavering sense of justice, he couldn't shake the image of Benjamin's resolute gaze before the verdict was read. The young man had not begged, had not pleaded, only stood firm in his belief that, one day, the truth would be revealed. That unwavering conviction left an imprint on Scott's mind. What if he was telling the truth? Then, when everything seemed to be settled, a name unexpectedly resurfaced, one that would change everything. A forgotten case file buried deep in old records contained a crucial detail that had gone unnoticed. Within its pages was mention of a gun, the same gun that had been overlooked in Benjamin's trial, linked to another robbery just days before his alleged crime. But that wasn't all. The weapon bore a distinctive marking that matched the scratches on the barrel of the gun used by Ryan Hale, a convicted felon from the earlier case. Judge Scott sat frozen, his hands trembling slightly, his heartbeat accelerating. Had he been deceived? Had he been used as a tool to deliver an unjust sentence? Suppressed evidence, altered testimonies. Was there a web of corruption woven so deeply within the justice system that even he, a veteran judge, had failed to see it? The puzzle pieces began to align in Scott's mind. He recalled an earlier investigation led by a detective named Lucas who had flagged discrepancies in the case. Missing reports, tampered evidence, each revelation hinted at a disturbing truth. It wasn't just Benjamin who had been deceived. The entire justice system had been manipulated. A system built to uphold justice had instead been turned into a machine of oppression, selectively silencing those who stood in its way. Each step deeper into the investigation led Scott toward a darker reality, one he hadn't dared to imagine. This wasn't just a case of a wrongful conviction. It was a revelation that exposed the rot festering within the very foundation of the legal system he had devoted his life to. How had corruption infiltrated so deeply? How many innocent lives had been destroyed in the process? Justice was hanging by a thread, and for the first time in his career, Scott felt the flicker of doubt creeping into his soul. Could he uncover the truth in time? Could he undo the damage that had already been done? And most importantly, could the justice system cleanse itself when the walls of corruption had become so impenetrable? The answers remained unknown, but one thing was clear. The fight for justice had only just begun, and it would change everything. Judge Thomas Scott sat in his dimly lit office, the glow from his desk lamp casting long shadows over the stacks of case files scattered before him. An unease had settled deep in his chest, a nagging doubt that he could no longer ignore. The suspicions he had once brushed aside about Benjamin King's case now loomed over him like a storm cloud. For 35 years, he had taken pride in his ability to deliver fair and impartial rulings, to ensure that justice was served without bias or error. But this time, something felt terribly wrong. His verdict against Benjamin wasn't just another sentencing. It may have been a grave miscarriage of justice. Scott had always believed in the system, in its ability to uncover the truth and administer justice accordingly. Yet, as he revisited the case, an unsettling realization crept into his mind. A small but crucial detail resurfaced, one he had overlooked in the trial. A preliminary investigation into the case had unearthed a key piece of evidence that had been inexplicably omitted. A gun. Scott's brow furrowed as he read through the notes, his pulse quickening. A gun that had not been submitted as evidence, yet was connected to the armed robbery for which Benjamin had been convicted. His grip on the papers tightened as his heart pounded against his ribs. How could something this vital have been ignored? This wasn't just an oversight. It was a gaping hole in the prosecution's case. As he dug deeper, the inconsistencies became glaringly clear. The missing evidence, the unreliable testimonies, the subtle manipulations in the legal proceedings. It was all beginning to form a sinister pattern. Benjamin's conviction wasn't just a mistake. It was orchestrated. Scott leaned back in his chair, his hands trembling slightly. Could it be possible? Had the very system he had dedicated his life to been manipulated to such an extent? Who had hidden the evidence? Who had pulled the strings behind the scenes to ensure that Benjamin was found guilty? How had these mistakes gone undetected for so long? And the most unsettling question of all, was the justice he had always upheld nothing more than an illusion in a system riddled with corruption? The truth was beginning to emerge, and Judge Scott knew he couldn't turn away. This was no longer just about one case or one wrongful conviction. It was about exposing a broken system, one that had failed the very people it was meant to protect. No matter the cost, Scott knew he had to keep digging. He couldn't allow Benjamin to be another casualty of a corrupt and negligent system. He had spent his entire career believing in justice. Now, he would have to fight to prove that it still existed. His investigation had only just begun, and the road ahead would be anything but easy. Judge Scott stood at his desk, gripping a thick stack of documents, his mind spinning with the revelations he could no longer ignore. A series of newly uncovered pieces of evidence made it painfully clear. Benjamin King's case was not just a judicial mistake. It was the result of deliberate manipulation, and all the clues led back to one name he never expected, Lucas, a detective Scott had once trusted implicitly. A man he believed would always uphold the ethics of his profession. A cold chill ran through Scott as he realized Lucas was not merely an uninvolved officer in this case. He had actively altered evidence and coerced witnesses into giving false testimony. The discovery hit Scott like a sudden, crushing blow, a twist he never saw coming. How could a man he had respected do such a thing? This wasn't just a betrayal of justice. It shook the very foundation of Scott's faith in the legal system he had devoted his entire life to. Questions swarmed in Scott's mind. Why had Lucas done this? What was his motive? How had he managed to manipulate the entire case so meticulously, from the smallest details to the key testimonies? How many people like Benjamin had suffered injustice because of corrupt officers like Lucas? A wave of regret crashed over Scott. He felt as though he had failed in his duty to protect justice, while someone like Lucas had exploited his position and authority to deceive everyone. With this new revelation, Scott knew he couldn't ignore it, but he also understood that pursuing the truth would be dangerous. Lucas was no ordinary detective. He had powerful connections, and going against him could cost Scott everything. But if he stayed silent, justice would remain tainted. He found himself caught in an impossible choice. Fight for the truth, no matter the risk, or turn a blind eye and let the corruption remain buried forever. The tension in Scott's chest tightened. He understood that whatever decision he made now would define the rest of his life. The truth had been unveiled, and there was no turning back. But one thing haunted him. Was he truly ready to face Lucas, to risk his career, his reputation, perhaps even his life? Or should he wait for more proof, something undeniable, before taking action? As the weight of his decision settled upon him, Scott knew he stood at the precipice of the most difficult choice he had ever faced. The price of truth could be steep, but if he did nothing, he would forever live with the knowledge that he had allowed innocent lives to be destroyed by unchecked corruption. He realized this was no longer just about a single case. It was a battle to restore faith in justice, and no matter the cost, he couldn't walk away. Judge Thomas Scott sat in his office, staring at the scattered newspapers on his desk. Bold headlines about corruption in the police force and judiciary were shaking the entire city. Everything he had uncovered, every decision he had made, had now become the reason he was under attack from all sides. The weight of disappointment and tension wrapped around his chest like a tightening noose. His mind remained steadfast, but his heart was gnawed by an unrelenting question. Had he done the right thing? Were his former colleagues, the ones he had once respected, truly on the side of justice, or were they merely protecting their own interests? The air in his office felt stifling as Scott realized that it wasn't just him who was being targeted. His family was now in danger as well. Anonymous phone calls, scathing media reports, and cold stares from former allies made him feel like a man under siege. Exposing the truth had been necessary, but now he was facing the consequences of his actions. Every step forward, every move he made, carried an unbearable weight. Justice had to prevail, but could he continue fighting when the threats loomed so close? His faith in justice had never wavered, yet the crisis before him made him question everything. Had he done enough to fix the mistakes of the legal system? The threats were becoming more severe, but what hurt him most was the price he and his loved ones had to pay. The path he had chosen was fraught with peril, and one wrong move could cost him everything, even his safety, or worse, the lives of those he cared about. Still, a part of Scott refused to give up hope. He knew that if he didn't stand his ground, the truth would remain buried forever. If he didn't continue this fight, no one else would have the courage to do so. This battle was no longer just about him. It was for all those who had been wronged, for those who still believed in true justice. And even if it meant enduring isolation, criticism, and looming dangers, Scott knew he couldn't turn back now. As a judge, he had sworn to uphold justice, but as he faced the wrath of those determined to silence him, he had to ask himself, would justice ever bring him peace? And when everything crumbled around him, would he still be able to live with himself? These questions haunted him, but one truth remained undeniable. He had chosen to stand on the side of truth, no matter the cost. Sebastian stepped into Judge Thomas Scott's office, his expression tense but resolute. The two had worked on numerous cases together, but this time, everything was different. With just one glance, Sebastian knew that Scott had embarked on a battle where truth alone would not be enough to win. Every shred of evidence they uncovered, each overlooked email, each manipulated report, was leading them toward a far darker reality than Scott had ever imagined. They sat together, facing the computer screen, as emails scrolled past like fragmented pieces of a larger, sinister puzzle. "These reports have been altered," Sebastian said, his voice slightly unsteady, but his eyes burning with determination. "Everything leads to one name, Lucas. He fabricated evidence and manipulated Benjamin's case." A shock ran through both of them. This was no ordinary mistake. What they had uncovered was a deep-rooted network of corruption within the very system they had spent their careers believing in. Scott felt a tightness in his chest. Every click, every falsified document felt like tearing through the very fabric of justice he had sworn to uphold. The legal system he had worked so hard to preserve suddenly felt fragile, built on layers of deception. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had been blind to the truth for too long. As the veil of deception was slowly lifted, a pang of regret settled over Scott. They should have seen this sooner, but now there was no turning back. Scott faced an impossible decision: how to stand firm in this fight when the corruption had been woven into the system for so long. Could they uncover everything before the forces working against them closed in? Sebastian, sensing the judge's turmoil, shrugged slightly, his voice steady with conviction. "We won't stop. Justice has to be restored for Benjamin." And as the night deepened outside, his words stood as a beacon, illuminating the road ahead. Both men knew this battle wouldn't be easy, but they had the truth, and more importantly, they had each other. Hope, though faint, was finally beginning to flicker amidst the darkness. Judge Scott sat alone in his office, the city lights casting faint shadows against the walls. Despite the darkness outside, a fire of determination burned inside him. The evidence he and Sebastian had uncovered wasn't just about one wrongful conviction. It had the power to shake the entire legal system he had spent over 3 decades building. He clutched the file that contained the long-buried truth, his heart pounding, but he knew he couldn't turn back now. The truth must come out. Ever since discovering the discrepancies in Benjamin's case, Scott had felt a growing unease. He knew those behind this conspiracy weren't just low-level criminals. These were individuals who had manipulated the very system meant to uphold justice. People who had ruined lives while hiding behind a badge or a judge's robe. But exposing them meant facing an adversary far more dangerous than a single corrupt official. Choosing to make this public, calling for an independent investigation, was a high-risk move. Scott knew the repercussions would be severe. Tensions would escalate and danger would follow. Threats would come, but retreat was not an option. This wasn't just about Benjamin anymore. It was about reclaiming justice itself. And when he finally announced his decision to the public, there was no hesitation in his gaze. Doubt was gone. There was only one path forward, to bring the truth into the light, no matter the cost. But things weren't as simple as he had hoped. Those who had orchestrated this deception weren't going to sit idly by. The backlash was immediate. The threats began. Anonymous calls, ominous messages, warnings disguised as casual remarks. The corruption that had been hidden for so long was beginning to show its teeth. Yet Scott remained steadfast. He understood that if he backed down now, the truth would be buried forever. People would ask, could he withstand the pressure? Could the truth survive against the powerful forces trying to suppress it? The questions echoed in his mind, but Scott no longer had the luxury of hesitation. He had made his choice, and no matter the danger, no matter the cost, he would see this fight through to the very end. The courtroom was deathly silent, every eye locked on Judge Thomas Scott as he rose, his expression calm, yet his mind raging with turmoil. The tension in the air was suffocating, not just because of the weight of his impending decision, but because of what awaited him once the verdict was delivered. His fight for justice had led him to this moment, a moment that could change not just Benjamin's fate, but the very system he had dedicated his life to upholding. Scott looked at Benjamin, standing at the defense table, his eyes filled with both hope and fear. After years of wrongful imprisonment, he might finally be free. But his freedom was not an act of mercy. It was the truth finally clawing its way to the surface after being buried for too long. Scott glanced around the room, where reporters sat poised, ready to capture history. The testimonies, the fabricated evidence, the system's corruption. It had all been laid bare. Today, justice would prevail, even if the price was Scott's career and reputation. The tension inside the courtroom mounted with each passing second. Everyone held their breath as Scott finally spoke. "The conviction of Benjamin King is hereby overturned," he declared, his voice steady, unshaken. Due to serious errors in the judicial process and undeniable evidence of evidence tampering, this court acknowledges a grave miscarriage of justice. The courtroom erupted. Cheers and applause rippled through the gallery like a tidal wave. Benjamin's mother sobbed uncontrollably, clutching her chest as relief and disbelief overwhelmed her. Benjamin himself stood frozen, his hands trembling as if reality had yet to catch up with him. He had spent years fighting for this moment, but now that it had arrived, he could hardly comprehend it. But behind the joy of a man reclaiming his stolen freedom lay the cost Scott would have to bear. His ruling was more than just a legal decision. It was a seismic shock to a system that had long shielded the guilty and punished the innocent. The backlash would be swift and unforgiving. Threats would come, former colleagues would turn against him, and the weight of public scrutiny would be relentless. But what kept Scott standing tall? The unwavering belief in truth and justice, no matter the personal sacrifice. Because in this world, sometimes the only right thing to do is to face the truth, no matter how devastating it may be. And in that moment, Benjamin was free, but Scott, the man who had given his life to the law, was about to step into a battle unlike any he had ever faced. The investigation was complete, and the truth had finally come to light. Police officers and court officials implicated in Benjamin's case were arrested, and sweeping reforms within the justice system had begun. But for Judge Scott, this was not the end. The battle he had ignited was never just about one wrongful conviction. It was about dismantling a broken system, about restoring faith in justice, about demanding real accountability. Scott stood alone in a dimly lit room, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. Everything had changed. His colleagues, once friends, had turned their backs on him. The press and public pressure had made him feel like an outcast within the very institution he had dedicated his life to. And yet, in his mind, one image remained. Benjamin's eyes, grateful, relieved, but also tinged with sorrow. Benjamin had won his freedom, but the cost of that freedom had been immeasurable. And Scott knew this was far from over. Corruption had been exposed, but would that be enough to heal the wounds inflicted by a system that had failed so many? Could one victory rewrite an entire history of injustice? These questions haunted Scott each night, keeping him awake long after the city had fallen silent. He couldn't forget that he, too, had once been complicit in a system that had failed an innocent man. And now he had to live with that. Yet, deep down, Scott knew he couldn't walk away. The fight for justice was far from over. No matter how difficult the road ahead, he refused to accept a world where the system he once trusted continued to operate unchanged. With unwavering resolve, he pressed forward, not just for Benjamin, but for every other soul who had been robbed of justice. Because true justice wasn't just about one case. It was about rewriting the rules so that no one else would have to suffer the same fate. After being freed, Benjamin King not only reclaimed his freedom, but also discovered a new and profound purpose in life. His heart was no longer consumed by anger or despair. Instead, it was filled with hope and determination. He had lost too many years to wrongful imprisonment, and now he resolved to use the years ahead to make a meaningful difference. Benjamin began fighting not just for himself, but for those like him, those trapped in the cycle of an outdated and unjust judicial system. He met with individuals suffering from wrongful convictions, listened to their stories, and helped them seek the truth. From offering simple advice to leading large-scale advocacy efforts, Benjamin gradually became a beacon of hope for those who had lost faith in justice. With each story he heard, with each encounter he had, the pain within him deepened. But in those moments, he also realized that these very people gave him the strength to keep going. They were not just seeking freedom for themselves, but also recognition and justice for all those whom society had forgotten. And Benjamin became an indispensable part of the fight for truth, a guide, an inspiration to those who had never given up hope. Looking back, Benjamin no longer felt regret or resentment. He understood that life was not always fair, but at least he had the power to change the lives of others. With each passing day, he came to see that helping others was not just an act of kindness, but also a crucial step in healing himself. Ultimately, despite the challenges that lay ahead, Benjamin no longer felt alone. He had found a new family, a community of individuals willing to fight for justice, where every story mattered and every life deserved protection. His battle had only just begun, but it had already opened up a new horizon filled with hope and the desire for change. The story of Benjamin King and Judge Scott serves as a profound lesson about the power of justice and perseverance in the fight against injustice. Sometimes, the very systems we trust can become shields for wrongdoing, but the truth always finds a way to emerge, no matter how long it takes. Through Benjamin's journey, we see that wrongful convictions not only strip people of their freedom, but also force them to grapple with an overwhelming sense of injustice. However, the key is to never give up. Benjamin did not just reclaim his freedom, he became a guiding light for others, helping them find hope and justice. The lesson to take away from this story is that each of us has a responsibility to stand up for the truth and fight for justice. Even in the face of challenges and dangers, if we persist and stand for what is right, we can create profound change. This story also reminds us that empathy and compassion can ease suffering and support those trapped in the shadows of an unjust system. Benjamin King's journey is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of adversity and injustice, and a call for all of us to continue striving for a fairer world. Thank you for watching. If you found this video interesting or enjoyable, please show your support by giving it a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow and reach more amazing viewers like you. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our future uploads. Your support means the world to us and keeps us motivated to create even better content for you.